Hello. Today I want to discuss a pressing economic issue that significantly impacts India's financial health, the fiscal deficit and public debt. These terms often dominate economic discussions, but understanding their implication is important for a nation's economic growth and stability. So what are fiscal deficit and public debt? The fiscal deficit occurs when the total expenditure of any government exceeds its total revenues. This shortfall indicates how much the government needs to borrow to finance its activities. The accumulation of these borrowings over time constitutes the public debt, representing the total amount that the government owes to creditors. Now, talking about India's current fiscal landscape, as of March 2025, the fiscal deficit for the April-February period reached 13.47 trillion rupees, accounting for 85.8% of the annual target. Net tax receipts during the period were 20.16 trillion, while the government expenditure was 38.93 trillion. The government aims to reduce the fiscal deficit to 4.4% of the GDP by 25-26 financial year, and plans to shift its fiscal policy benchmark to the debt to GDP ratio instead, targeting a reduction to 50% by March 2031 from the current 57%. Now, what are the implications of rising fiscal deficit and public debt? So, as you must know, the US is currently going through this problem. That's why President Trump is talking about all of these tariffs. So, what he basically wants to do is to make the Fed, which is the Federal Reserve, which is basically the institution which deals with monetary policy in the US. He wants them to implement tariffs so that they basically import less and produce more, which will reduce unemployment. And as you know, when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. And since inflation would go up, they would have to reduce the interest rate that they have over there, right? And that basically means he would be able to refinance the 30.4 trillion out of the 30.4 trillion dollar debt that they've accumulated. They can basically refinance they have to I think pay off 7.4 trillion of that right now. So he basically wants to refinance the whole loan at a lower interest rate, which would be great for the US economy. So coming back to India. So what are the implications of rising fiscal deficit and public debt? Basically, higher debt levels lead to increased interest payments, which can consume a significant portion of the government revenues, limiting funds available for development initiatives. Now, there's also the crowding out effect. Extensive government borrowing can lead to higher interest rates, potentially discouraging private sector investments. There's inflationary pressures. Financing deficits through borrowing, especially from the central bank, can increase the money supply, potentially leading to inflation. And there's also credit rating concerns. Persistent high deficits and escalating debt levels may prompt credit ratings agencies to downgrade India's sovereign rating, making external borrowing more expensive. Coming to a historical perspective, India has basically grappled with fiscal deficits and rising public debt for decades. The Fiscal Deficit and Budget Act FRBM of 2003 was a significant step towards institutionalizing fiscal discipline. However, deviations from its targets have occurred, especially during economic downturns and crises, highlighting the challenges in adhering to fiscal consolidation paths. So, what are some strategies to managing fiscal deficit and public debt? So, addressing these challenges requires a multifaceted approach, which basically starts with enhancing revenue generation. The easiest path to do that is basically to broaden the tax base. So implement measures to increase tax compliance, and bringing more entities into the tax net can boost revenues. Secondly, disinvestment and asset monetization. Selling stakes in public sector enterprises and monetizing underutilized units can basically provide immediate fiscal relief. They can also rationalize expenditures. If they're spending something in a department that they should not be spending much in, then they can restructure the whole spending. There can be subsidy reforms, streamlining subsidies to ensure that they are targeted and efficiently can reduce unnecessary expenditures. They can also prioritize capital expenditure. Allocating funds towards infrastructure and other capital projects can stimulate economic growth and generate further revenues. They can also adhere to fiscal targets. Committing to frameworks like the FRBM Act ensures disciplined fiscal management. They can establish independent fiscal councils. An autonomous body can monitor fiscal performance and provide objective analysis and recommendations. And the hardest would be to, I guess, encourage economic growth. So there have to be structural reforms. Implementing policies that enhance productivity, ease of doing business, and the labor market flexibility can foster growth. They can also invest in human capital. Enhancing education and skill development can increase the employability and productivity of the workforce. I think recently I saw news which basically said that India only spends 3% of its expenditures on education, which is pretty low, and they should probably do something about it. Now, there are some barriers to implementation. Implementing these barriers is not without challenges. Public constraints, reforms such as subsidy cuts or disinvestment can face political opposition and public resistance. There's always economic uncertainties like external shocks, global financial crisis, or pandemics. There's also institutional limitations. Weak institutional frameworks can hinder effective policy implementation and enforcement. So, managing fiscal deficit and public debt is a delicate balancing act. While borrowing is sometimes necessary to finance development and counter economic downturns, it's imperative to ensure that debt levels remain sustainable. through prudent fiscal management, structural reforms, and a commitment to transparency, India can navigate these challenges and come out on top, basically showing robust economic growth and stability. Thank you.